I am going to talk about DevOps and that it's driven by behaviors. Interesting enough, I think you'll see elements of what I talk about that have been brought up since the morning in several sessions when it comes to the assembly line processes and the behaviors that are in there. Okay, so it's something that I tend to focus in on in my past experience prior to coming to FE-Code, where it's not just trying to create one team. It's really about what Marco mentioned in the enterprise approach. That's where you're going for it, right? Anybody can create lightning in a bottle, as I say, but it's moving your entire organization towards thinking and acting like this. And the behaviors are sort of an undercurrent, as you'll see. So, this quote, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Does anybody know who's attributed with actually saying that? Henry Ford, that's right. Henry Ford, the man who started Ford Motor Company. Right there. Now, this is a picture of Henry Ford. Looks like a ray of sunshine, doesn't he? Very serious, industrious man back in the day when there was no labor standards. But a fun fact, he didn't actually say this, okay? There's no credible written or documented evidence that he said it or wrote it himself. That's true, right? If you look it up and you do actually the research on it. But what it does, however, is convey actually what he was known to feel about customers being able to articulate what they really wanted back then. It also illustrates that Henry Ford didn't really have the willingness to listen to customer feedback and adopt it at that time. And if you think about it, that's often how companies used to think before adopting customer feedback in a reliable and timely manner became a key business driver, right? And so basically, when you look at things like time to market, quality, frequent releases, which have all been brought up, this is and what has been driving so many companies to adopt DevOps practices into their organizations and try to transform them accordingly, right? Now, if you ask me, I don't think old Henry Ford would have been much on incorporating DevOps at his time, because unlike that quote, he famously did say, customers can have any color car they want as long as it's black. So not really for bringing that in. But it's the same kinds of reservations that he probably would have had that many companies also have when thinking about how to approach bringing and introducing DevOps practices into their own organizations. They struggle with them to this day. Now in Ford's case, he had a plan. He had a strategy and a vision for sure. And what it was built on was taking the technology and the techniques of his day and harnessing them together in a way that allowed him not just to focus on creating cars, right, automobiles at the time, but to do them and create cars in a repeatable way, to produce cars more efficiently and to produce cars at a lower cost than any other automobile manufacturer at that time, right? Does it sound a little familiar? Similar to what DevOps practices offer organizations anyway as a selling point, right? It's true. And what he did was he used those things that were available and leveraged things like the assembly line, right? And the assembly line in our world is the DevOps tool chain and the automated processes that go with it. He made heavy use of interchangeable parts. And in our world, that's component-based design, use of containers. And he also introduced the $5 working day, something completely unheard of at the time, right? In fact, it was double the average daily wage of workers back then. But what that did was allow him to drive a certain level of dedication and culture in that organization that would help him focus on improving the assembly processes that he needed to get that lower cost, right? And that's very similar to the way culture is a critical driver to implementing DevOps successfully, right? So when taken all together, what this did was to allow him to develop the thing that gave him the biggest advantage, and that was the moving assembly line. The assembly line existed. He created this thing, the moving assembly line, right? And when it was working, he actually was able to create more automobiles and at a lower cost than anybody at the time. Something that worked very well for him for quite a long time, actually. Right? Sounds like a winning strategy. Well, at this point, At this point, you're thinking, Chris, that is a fascinating story. Glad to know a little bit about Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company, but what does it have to do with DevOps? Right? Well, I'll tell you. What I'm trying to do is connect that point to you thinking about how many companies go about introducing DevOps. They tend to focus on two things: the assembly line aspect of it and the frequency of releases. Right? They're the buzz things, what you get going. But unfortunately, and often quickly, they lose sight of many of the other essential factors that are needed to make DevOps successful. Releasing reliable working code frequently into production is a result built on many contributing factors, not just the assembly line or the automation processes. Remember, it is easy to produce poorly working, bad code frequently and release it into production without a lot of effort. Some of you may be there now or have had experience with that. I don't know. I won't say anything about it. But the good news is everything you need is out there, right? All the tools, and you've seen some examples of that today, the technical skills and the resources, which we have plenty of, and there's others out there for sure, and even the knowledge about what core processes you need to automate and tackle first and how to maybe go about doing that, right? And that's a good thing. But don't get me wrong, your DevOps toolchain is essential. It's a fundamental pillar of getting any DevOps organization moving and having something to work on. But it's not the only thing. You really do need to focus in and also help support the behaviors needed to progress that, right? You need to basically help foster those behaviors in the beginning and help sustain them as you move forward, right? So what kind of behaviors am I talking about? Well, specifically, I'm going to break it down into 3 areas, right? And respect for the time that we have, I want to make sure that we can cover some things that are important. So I've chosen these 3 areas because I do think they're important, but they're also relevant to progressing your DevOps initiative. And they are behaviors that you foster within development teams themselves that help things like team identity, what they focus in on, how prioritization is defined, but more so about establishing the norms of how we do it, and we being your company. Across the organizational units, right? Very important. That's the whole nature of what DevOps is about. But this is, for lack of a better term, silo busting. I know it sounds aggressive and a bit harsh, but essentially that is what you want to do. You're trying to tear down the barriers without eroding a lot of the natural infrastructure in your organization. This is where you're also going to look at sharing of responsibilities and resources, and maybe even having open discussions about governance or rules and guidelines that you actually do. And then behaviors at the leadership level. It's very important. Everything from what are the business drivers and why they're doing it, how this connects to the strategic outlier of the company, and more importantly, to create some space for learning and experimentation. Because DevOps is a change process. And when you go about any change process, you have to allow the organization to adopt it in its own unique way, right? So let's start to break these down a little bit more. And the first of these will be the development teams themselves. And the behavior I'm going to talk about may seem simplistic, but what I also know is that within teams, collaboration is essential for any team to perform well. And that doesn't matter if it's an IT team or any team, right? And when you want to build collaboration, one thing that helps do that is by nurturing minor little habits along the way. And if you start those early and maintain them throughout, they can really go a long way towards establishing those behaviors you want. So for instance, writing clear and articulate user stories. We've heard and seen agile development and lean practices are really essential if you're going to undertake DevOps. Most times you'll use Kanban boards and have Scrum teams. And you've seen probably Kanban boards, or maybe have some, where people put a sticky up there and there's something as a handwritten note on it. Maybe it's clear, maybe it's not. What degree of depth is in there? That's a variation introduced into the process from the very beginning. 3 different people could pull that off the ready to go and read it and say, well, am I going to do this? How am I going to do it? What's the true scope of it, right? If you're trying to size things in batches and sprints to get it through, it needs a little bit more work. It's actually helping to focus not by making really, really tight specifics, but just a little bit more respect for what you're actually telling people to do or putting expectations on them. Use of acceptance criteria is the other side of it, right? Because what the acceptance criteria does is it qualifies that piece of work. And it also helps incorporate things that operations needs. So for instance, you're not just going to have random error handling that says, for in the logs, error, error, error. Make a comment. So when this error happens, it means this. Because that looks at the supportability of that one piece of code. Testing, acceptance testing, units testing, they have to be created along with that. Maybe even updating the regression suite in order for that piece to be done. You're incorporating not just the feature of it being delivered because a product owner says so, you're looking at it from the end game that says this is how it's going to be supported for the long life of this one piece of work. And you can always adapt it, of course. But if you notice, this definition of done, have you ever heard that? Is it done or is it done? You don't want to be in that situation. It's either being pulled from the ready to go state, it's in progress, or it's completed. And your acceptance criteria tells it when it's done. If you need an iteration of something else, you do that, you craft it up in a story the next time and you run it through. It begins to shape the way people work. And that's important because it's driving a culture that focuses on everything, not just getting more tickets through and running down the burn down rate, right? When you have new people coming into teams, as they will, or moving from team to team, that behavior is founded in them. And you might say these could be put into developer guidelines or even developer governance in a document on a wiki somebody can go find and they point to it. But it's better if it becomes part of the behavior of people who are doing this work every day. And then when one person moves to another team, they have that behavior with them. They don't need to be told and informed. And the new people come in, they say, this is how we craft our stories when we're doing our planning. This is what we talk about in our stand-up every day, and we articulate that on this one story. And when I'm actually finishing it, I do all the work that needs to be finished. New developer, on board, one sprint, rock and roll. That's the kind of behavior you want to drive, and it starts with a simple thing like a ticket, right? It's not something to really be overlooked. The other thing that really helps drive behaviors, and I've talked about this in many other ways too, some of you may have seen that, is KPIs and metrics, right? And they are a really important driver of the right behaviors, and we'll see, and I'll talk about towards a little bit on what they can do to drive the wrong behaviors. But I'm going to pick one here that within the development team can actually, by putting focus on it, drive and shape several other positive behaviors you want to have that go the long way. And that is the developer feedback loop. You're familiar with it? You've heard about it. And I'm not talking about like customer feedback loop once it's in production. I'm talking about the lower end of it, development through the testing. That's it. That piece of the pipeline. When that feedback loop, from the time a person checks in on some code till they know it's working, red or green in the test set, how long is that? The shorter it gets, the less likely it is developers will start on new work, right? And if you're up on your agile lean, your WIP limit is something you want to control. The more cases you have in your WIP zone, you're in progress, the longer it takes for all of them to get through. It's the nemesis of trying to create more of an agile lean process, right? So if they're not wasting time because they can actually check in and get a feedback on it working or not, that's good. Otherwise, there's a natural inclination to do the opposite. It increases the quality because bad code is identified quickly, right? Otherwise, again, if you're waiting and you're working on 2 or 3 different things, you may forget about it. And it may move forward because it's not story complete. It passes upstream, and then somebody else has to find it closer to the production zone. And that's not what you want. More code commits per day. They may be new feature code, they may be enhancements to bugs, they may be updates, or they may be operational improvements to the way that your testing works, to the way your tooling works, or any of the pipeline mechanisms, right? It's all relevant when it comes to doing your continuous integration processes. And if you do look after your burn down rates, you probably see improvement in that. And the last, which is always near and dear to my heart, it keeps focus on your automated test suites. As your code base expands, number of tests should probably expand too. But that should not push the feedback loop longer and longer. You have to focus on doing the work to optimize and parallelize your suites of tests or figure out which ones are really relevant at this time of build and deployment to keep that feedback loop small. You focus in it in your weekly or your sprint-based retrospectives. It becomes part of the conversation. How long is that? It's not good or bad, it's where you are. But you have to focus on that metric getting smaller and smaller, and by doing so, these are the positive results that come from it. It's another small thing by one metric helping drive out good behaviors that go a long way across your organization. Now, the other area is behaviors across organizational units. It gets a little more tricky, right? You can always do a team, some good project manager or whatever team lead can do it, but organization, you need some leadership. You need a little more oomph and some thinking. And I'm going to, for simplicity, use development operations. Traditional mindset's what we call DevOps, right? And that is to be a lot of where the frictions are. And I would say you want to probably focus on two main goals with this. One is that infrastructure is created and how it's version controlled. It's a simple statement. But the other is you're reducing this my territory thinking, right? By having those two things as goals and having them stated to the right people across, you can begin to put your mission, which if I had to say it simply would be that you should always be able to create, configure, deploy on infrastructure that is created on demand, right? That's your mission. And I know it tends to fall heavily more on the operations side because they do the infrastructure, they deliver it, they manage the production deployments. So it's not poking at them. But that's the mission. Your infrastructure and the way it needs to be supported, delivered to everybody who's working on it should happen and easily, just like you're changing code. So what continuous integration does for the development teams, this kind of stuff needs to happen for your infrastructure. Infrastructure is code. It's not just a statement, it is a goal. And when you shape it that way, and the leadership does so, and you bring the people from the teams together, not to say, well, operations has to come up for a way to do it because the developers are just doing their thing. It doesn't work that way. You got to build that bridge. And by building the bridge, you start to reshape the structure of the organizational's thinking and maybe even the organization itself in a subtle way. But the challenges come in from this. DevOps and DevOps people, the staff, are typically driven by separate KPIs. There's nothing wrong in that inherently. They're not doing anything wrong. They're doing what they've been told. Operations is uptime and minimal risk and deployment errors and mean time to resolution, all that good stuff. And development, they are basically churning out new features, testing it and getting it ready to go out. And there's a clash between those two. So you need to drive the right behaviors and not have people focusing on opposite things that are not going to support your DevOps. Get leadership to say, you people that are working in this space are having similarly vested KPIs. Doesn't mean you have to get rid of the operational ones, but maybe you reduce them down in their weight. Weight on just the way these new applications are. The rest of the organization will have it this way. But for these, you are definitely driven by making sure that you can create that on-demand architecture that supports them, right? The other thing is that you're allowing for shared responsibilities. Developers don't just develop code and then test it and move it on and hand it over. And operations people are not the only people responsible for managing, setting up, and delivering infrastructure. They have to do it shared. Production deployments, people from both areas are part of it. When it comes to coding and scripting the way you use Docker and making the containers work to help the different development streams and the way those branching strategy has to work, they have to be part of that. So the operations people who don't typically think that way get it firsthand. And they're learning to understand it as well. So the minds are kind of marrying the train of thought. The one thing you really want to do in this space is use the term manual. That's a naughty word. If you see something that's manual in a process, and it doesn't have to be, a reconfiguration of WebLogic on a server, it means it's a manual step that says somebody gets this spreadsheet and looks over the features before it gets deployed. Anything. Put that on a sticky, make it nice, right? But then use a way to find somehow to script that out, right? Because anything you can do manually, you should really be able to script and start to optimize it within your process. And the metrics on end-to-end, as far as the sub pieces of it, can help you do that too. And the last is getting ways of thinking. Developers and operations people, because of the KPIs, because of historical ways of working and where they are in many organizations, they do think differently. And you want to try to change their DNA so that developers do think like operations people. They think about the long-term supportability, the ease of going into production with the deployments, and what happens at 3 in the morning when something goes off. And the same thing with operations folks. They're using the tools that they may not be familiar with to orchestrate changes and maintenance and everything else across the swath of what they're doing. Could be in a cloud, it could be hosted wherever it is, but again, you don't have to change the entire organization in one blow. You sort of eat it in a chunk and then move that forward and move it forward further on. But you do need to blend these people, and the best way is to blend the working responsibilities, even if it means moving some people into the teams so they're sitting next to each other for periods of time. All right? And the last of these behavioral areas I'll talk about is leadership. Right? Probably one of the most important things for any change initiative or anything that's big in the strategy of it. And this goes without exception. I mean, executives can buy in. We need some DevOps. We're going to do that. We're going to be DevOps enabled. And then they walk away because they're on the next big thing. That doesn't work. It has to be sustainable. My thinking is if it's part of the strategic vision on a bullet list, it's worthwhile and important enough to tackle all other things that are seemingly important by other different people in the past. And that needs to be thought of and supported. But a few areas that I bring up are this opening the gates a bit. And what I think of this is leadership allows the maneuverability for people, resources, teams to work differently, to challenge the governance, right? Again, we're not changing everything, business as usual over here, but in this space, we're moving people together. We're clearing out desks, we're moving people and relocating them, we're getting them closer together, we're allowing scrum boards. It's going to be a bit messy. We're going to use cloud infrastructure, and we're going to have all these things. That maneuverability space, the budget, the time, and the allocation has to come from leadership. You can talk about it, you can say we need this from the bottom up, but leadership has to open its way. And that's part of their behavioral shift in thinking about how far they get into the mix of a change like this. It also comes down to the regular engagement. Again, depending on the level of leadership, how much they engage with the DevOps initiative, right? I think it's important that the most senior leaders bring in the business or other parts of it that need to be understanding what's happening. First and foremost thing is it's not an IT thing, DevOps. It's an organizational thing. And where and how much business needs to come into play, accounting and procurement, because maybe there's purchases of tools and so forth. We can't wait 6 months to get a license for our enterprise on this tool. We need to get it now. There has to be some agility in thinking about that. So how their interests are met and maintained to support this strategic initiative needs to come through with the engagement of the leaders at the level that they sit at. Understanding the total DevOps transformation. This has to do with understanding the metrics, not just looking at things like frequency into production, mean time to resolution. The end metrics, which are very positive and nice to have and need to have, but the early ones, the things that you really want to notice and foster in the beginning of your initiative, the first 90 days, the first 6 months, and so on. So that way you're looking across the entire DevOps transformational change and knowing where you are and where you've progressed from. And the last is featuring a blameless culture. I think I probably touched a little bit on this before, but in the first statement, but it's really allowing certain types of experimentation and learning from what worked and what didn't. The hardest part of this is the behavior where your organization, like Jan said earlier, they have to work in this sort of waterfall mindset because it's a public entity. They have to tender and budget accordingly and work the way they need to, the best possible way within that. But it's tough. So really, you want to make sure that if you experiment with something, it didn't work out, you shifted it, and it worked out the second time, you didn't lose 2 weeks. You're not 2 weeks behind on a deadline. You've improved. And that is part of that openness, and leadership has to support that so people don't become to get panicked and pull backwards. Now, with any kind of behavior, good behaviors can be fostered just like bad behaviors, right? And if you have children, you definitely don't want them picking up on your own bad behaviors, right? You just want them to do the good stuff. And doing as I say and not as I do does not work. So if you have children, there's my piece of advice for you. But I'll use this example as one that I think is common in that waterfall. We're trying to move and shift to an agile company using DevOps thing, where you still have on-time delivery for whatever reason. It's measurable, it's out there, and we need it. Versus something like automated testing, which you know you need to be DevOps enabled. It's a core part of your continuous delivery pipeline. But then who wins the day? Now, on-time delivery is a measure of success, for sure. But it's not the only measure of success, and it's not necessarily the most important measure of success. Because if you're really moving to continuous delivery, right, you're able to deliver on demand or at the pace that you need, so an on-time date becomes irrelevant. I mean, you have to work your way there, but eventually you just start thinking it's irrelevant because I'm just going to do it next Saturday, I'm going to do it next Monday, and whenever. So stop making on-time delivery dates a thing and stop weighing them so much. But if you do outweigh it, all right, it's heavy. 75% is on project managers or something like that. As people progress and they get behind because they've experimented or the scope's creeped or something else like that, you may get variabilities in the suite itself, how much automated testing is happening in one team versus the other. So cross-organizationally, you're not maintaining a standard that you want. You may have teams that have a very good working standard of tests along with their functionality, but they got thrown a curveball. Now they have to add 2 new features into this thing. The data's still there, they're behind. Do they develop it? Or maybe they don't update the tests as much. So tests that were really working as a nice tight suite start to then blink red. They know they're red, they ignore them because they're out of date. We're just going to let the testers deal with that when they do the manual testing. Doesn't work. You're eroding your own forward progress. And DevOps sometimes is a game of inches. You just don't want to give up the inches that are hard earned. And when you have a working test suite, maintaining it as you build out is a key part of it. And the other thing is that if you're not maintaining your test suite, and it's not a normalized thing when people go from one team to the next, you may have a new team that starts up. New project manager comes in, they put together some developers, they bring in the behaviors and habits from previous work assignments or other jobs. They're all good, they're doing their thing, but the focus isn't on that. And then you have a completely different model for a new application, and then it maybe goes on its own divergent path. Again, that's a problem. So you want to try to avoid that by putting the right balance on a KPI, if it's going to be there. Understand why you're going to measure it, and then make sure that it doesn't drive the wrong things. Okay? And that's something that really comes into the leadership realm. They have to know that and be aware of it. And the last thing is, I'll leave you with this. This came from something I used to use in my teams across for a long time ago, is that there's no crying in DevOps. Full stop. Can't have it. And that really comes from the fact that if you're going to be a champion and a leader in any way of your DevOps initiative, wherever you are and where you stand, and you talk positively about it and you're going to move this thing forward, you're going to have a little bit of thick skin to do so, right? And I'll tell you why. Because there is countless and numerous ways for people who are being kind of shaken loose or having to think differently, do different things, to point at this and say, see, that's not working. You're causing me a delay. You know, I'm trying to do this. It worked the last time. Now you're in my way. See, you said you were going to deliver this by this week. It's not here, right? It's always easy to focus and bring up the negative, and that starts to easily erode any of the positive. It's for that reason I strongly believe, I mean, from the core of my, bottom of my toes to the top of my head, organizations and leaderships need to celebrate the small victories that happen along the way, and there will be plenty of them. And they need to do so openly and verbally throughout the organization of the teams that are doing the work. But on the same note, they need to, without blame, understand and say what's not in place or is not working well, right? And when you do that through correct and proper metrics and the right KPIs, you're speaking from quantifiable data, which also helps remove perception or misperception in many cases. And that is filled with emotions a lot of times too. And that emotionally charged area helps denigrate your DevOps progress, right? So I think the leadership, when they do this and they start to talk about these things and champion them the right way, you begin to build trust in your organization, right? Trust to the people I call hands-on keyboard who are doing it every day, the heavy lifting, The teams, the developers, the project managers, the leads, the program directors, everybody. You build trust in them that they know they're supported by their organization and by their leadership. It builds trust in them that they know when they make mistakes or there's minor setbacks, they're not going to get blamed and criticized, but it's an opportunity to learn and understand or innovate. And they believe, because they're trusted, that what they do every day is connected to a strategic vision that is important for the long-term success of their organization. When you build that kind of trust across your organization, not just within teams, but across the different units, you then really begin the foundation of changing your organization to be DevOps enabled, and the culture will shift accordingly. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for the very, very great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was super, super inspiring. I'd like to ask you, is there any book in regards to DevOps and behavior that you would recommend? Because your predecessors mentions some books here and there. I'm just curious if you have anything in mind.
I haven't finished it yet, to tell you the truth. If I can float that out there, but yeah.
So you're writing one?
Yeah, I have been crafting it for a long time. I have an outline, and my wife is finally telling me to do something or get off the pot with it, and I take my notes. So I don't know if there is myself, if I've seen anything. I've seen some of the ones that were shown up here earlier and read them myself and others, but nothing specifically that focuses on behaviors, which I think that's why I want to get this out there, because not that it'll make me $1 gazillion, but it's something that I've felt and crafted a long time. I mean, I worked at Maersk Line and Maersk Group IS for 6.5, almost 7 years before I came to EFICode. And through that organization and all the different stuff that was learned, behaviors is a big part of what helps shapes teams and goes across it. And it's not to be touchy-feely. It's not just to say, well, it's a leadership book about DevOps. It touches that, but it's connected at its foundation to what DevOps is. And that's my mantra for anything else. So, you know, it doesn't take away from what Marco said or anyone else said in the technology deep areas, because that's all very fascinating. But I look at it in a broader sense, because that's where I sat and what I dealt with in my time there.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you. I'll be sure to blast you all. Buy it. It's out there. Join my Twitter feed.
We have a question.
Yeah.
How do you overcome the waterfall thinking whilst building a highly agile team? Can you reinforce 3 key takeaways?
I want to say something that's bold, and it depends on comfort levels. I'd say ignore it, first of all. I know it's a challenge, but like I said, and I have plenty of scars to show for it in my time at Maersk, you have to do some things and apologize later in order to progress things. Waterfall thinking is one of those. I believe you can start doing, I forget what the word is, it's like waterfall agile mix, because you have a longer scope. Let's say you have a 12-month project that's planned. It's budgeted, scoped, and you have milestones. The first thing you do is you try to erode the relevance of any milestone by also showing progress in meaningful ways. You need to put in your stakes that are the key measures of value to the organization, not to the project. I think that's where most people go away, is that they're still focused on the project delivery, success or failure, right? But you're talking about something broader. And business value is delivered not just by what goes into production always. There's a lot of business value that's tied to the transformation. And you can look at things about, well, look how fast we got our tooling chain in progress. Now we have continuous integration, and 3 weeks ago we had none. We're now building out test suites, and each week our developers are adding about 3 to 5% more unit tests over our code base. That's measurable. That happens week over week. And you can look at the numbers. That's business value. Does it matter about a milestone? Maybe yes or no. You can always take that. But you're coming to the table with more than just where are you on this feature list based on this first milestone or something else. I think you have to shift the argument a little bit, because to do so, you're shifting people's mindsets and their expectations, truthfully. And depending on your level, and this is what makes it tough, if you're not at a high enough level where you can sort of open that space, like I said, you gotta get in there. I wouldn't say you gotta be a bare knuckle fighter, but you need to kind of maneuver and shift to make sure that the focus is paid to the right things at the right time. That's how you make change, really. Hope that answers the question. I think there was 3 points in there. I don't know. I tried, did my best.